You're standing at 15,000 feet on the Tibetan plateau. The wind hasn't stopped for 3 days. The temperature this morning was 40 degrees Celsius, and it's only October. There are no trees, no caves, no wood to burn. The air holds 60% of the oxygen your body expects, so you're exhausted before you even move. This is where Tibetan nomads raised families. They survived because they built everything around a single animal. They learned to turn hair into shelter and dung into heat. And they figured out something most settled people never had to, that in certain places, survival means knowing when to move. This is how they lived through winters that should have killed them. Chapter 1. The Tibetan Plateau sits higher than most commercial aircraft fly. At an average elevation of 4,500 meters, it's a landscape that operates by different rules than the lowlands. Cold here isn't just cold, it's cold with oxygen deprivation. Your body burns more calories doing nothing, trying to stay warm in air that can't fuel the work of staying warm. Temperature swings hit 30 degrees Celsius between day and night. A morning that starts at minus 35 degrees Celsius might reach minus 5 degrees Celsius by noon, then plunge again after sunset. The wind is constant, not occasional. It accelerates across the open plateau with nothing to stop it, driving cold through any gap in clothing, any weakness in shelter. There are no trees. This isn't a detail, it's the constraint that shaped everything. No logs for cabins, no firewood, no timber for tools or frames or fuel, just grass, rock, and sky. Winter lasted 8 months in the highest pasture lands. Snow didn't pile up like it does in forests. The wind stripped it away or packed it into ice. What remained was a frozen plain where water sources locked solid and the ground turned to stone. The nomads who lived here, the Drokpa, weren't passing through. This was their territory, their livelihood, their home. They stayed because the high grasslands, harsh as they were, offered something valuable: space to graze herds far from competing agricultural communities. The plateau's grass could support yaks, sheep, and goats if you managed it through movement. This wasn't chosen suffering. It was an economic niche that, once mastered, provided independence. But the environment gave them almost nothing to work with. No shelter, no fuel, no materials except what the animals provided, which meant the animals weren't just livestock, they were the infrastructure. The yak, specifically, became the platform for everything: shelter, clothing, food, and heat. The cold alone was survivable with enough layers and fuel. The altitude alone was survivable with acclimatization. But together, they created a double constraint. Your body needed more warmth, but the thin air made it harder to generate that warmth through work. Every task, collecting fuel, moving camp, managing herds, cost more energy than it would at sea level. And the landscape enforced a brutal lesson. You couldn't stockpile your way through winter. You couldn't build a fortified position and wait it out. The pastures couldn't support concentrated herds for months at a time. Overgraze your winter camp and your animals starve. Let your animals starve and you die. So the nomads developed a different approach. Instead of resisting the environment with permanent structures, they moved with it. They learned to read the signs that showed when to retreat to lower valleys and when to push back up to summer pastures. They built shelters that could be dismantled in hours and loaded onto yaks. They turned survival into a system of strategic migration, not fortification. The plateau wasn't empty. Archaeological evidence shows human habitation going back 15,000 years, possibly 30,000. People have been solving the problem of this landscape for longer than agriculture has existed. What the Tibetan nomads practiced wasn't primitive. It was the result of millennia of refinement. A knowledge system as complex as any farming culture's crop rotation or irrigation engineering. but it was knowledge built entirely around scarcity. How to stay warm without wood. How to create shelter without building materials. How to survive on what a herd could provide and nothing else. Chapter 2. The black tent was woven from yak hair, not the soft undercoat used for clothing, but the coarse outer guard hair that yaks shed in spring. This mattered. The outer hair had a specific property. When woven loosely and exposed to moisture, the fibers swelled and locked together, creating a water-resistant surface. When dry, microscopic gaps remained between fibers, allowing smoke to escape without letting heat pour out. The tent's color wasn't aesthetic. Black absorbed solar radiation during the day, even when air temperature sat below freezing. At high altitude, sunlight is intense. Thin atmosphere filters out less UV, and the snow-covered ground reflects it back upward. A black tent could be 20 degrees warmer inside than outside air temperature, purely from passive solar gain, no fire needed. The shape was aerodynamic. Rather than vertical walls that would catch wind and tear, the tent sloped from a low center ridgeline down to edges weighted with stones. Wind deflected over and around it. The front entrance faced away from prevailing winds, usually east or south, and could be sealed with felt panels or leather flaps. In the worst storms, families sealed the entrance completely and stayed inside until conditions allowed movement again. The tent wasn't staked. Frozen ground wouldn't accept stakes. Instead, guy ropes tied to the tent's edges ran to heavy stones placed in a circle around the perimeter. More stones weighted the tent's lower edges directly. You could adjust this anchoring system quickly as wind direction changed, and you could take it apart without tools. Inside, a central hearth burned continuously. The fuel was dried yak dung, the only combustible material available in a treeless landscape. The hearth sat directly on the ground, usually on a base of flat stones. There was no chimney. Smoke rose toward the tent's peak and gradually filtered out through the fabric and the gaps where roof panels met. The interior was smoky, always. Nomads lived in a constant haze that stung the eyes and coated everything with a fine black residue. But the smoke served a purpose beyond what they likely understood chemically. It deposited tar-like compounds onto the yak hair fibers, waterproofing them further and preserving the fabric. Tents that were regularly exposed to smoke lasted longer than those that weren't. The smoke filtration system also trapped heat. A chimney would have created a draft, pulling warm air up and out while drawing cold air in through gaps. The slow seepage of smoke through fabric meant heat stayed low where people lived and worked. Families divided the interior with curtains, additional panels of felt or woven fabric that created rooms within the single space. The area directly opposite the entrance, farthest from cold drafts, held the family shrine and served as the honored space for receiving guests. Sleeping areas flanked the sides, separated by curtains for minimal privacy. Storage occupied spaces near the entrance where cold air pooled. The floor was earth, covered with felt mats and sheepskins. These layers insulated sleepers from frozen ground. In the coldest months, families added more felt panels to the tent's exterior, creating a double wall system that trapped an insulating air gap. In summer, these extra layers were removed, and sometimes sections of the tent walls were rolled up to allow ventilation. Large tents housed extended families, sometimes 15 people. Smaller tents sheltered nuclear families or served as storage for valuable goods like butter, wool, and dried meat. Tent size was limited by available yak hair and by practical transport concerns. Larger tents required more yaks to carry them when camp moved. Young or weak animals sometimes spent nights inside the tent during the worst cold. A newborn yak calf represented significant wealth, and losing it to exposure was unacceptable. The calf's body heat contributed to warming the space, and its presence allowed the mother to be milked early in the morning before the herd dispersed to pasture. A family could take down the tent in under 3 hours. The process reversed construction, remove interior dividers and storage, collapse the roof panels, fold the fabric, load everything onto pack animals. The stones stayed behind. The next family to use that campsite, whether the same family returning seasonally or another group, would find the stone circle already in place. This portability was non-negotiable. The environment demanded movement. Summer pastures at higher elevations provided grass when lower areas browned. Winter camps in relative valleys offered wind protection when exposed ridges became uninhabitable. A shelter that couldn't move would trap families in places that became lethal as seasons changed. The tent was engineering built from observation. No one designed it in the modern sense. It evolved through generations of trial, failure, and incremental improvement. Families that built better tents survived to pass on their techniques. Families that didn't disappeared. Chapter 3. Everything needed to survive came from one animal. The yak was the whole system. Shelter came from it. Clothing came from it. Fuel came from it. Food came from it. The plateau offered almost nothing else, and this one species made living there possible. Yaks evolved for extreme altitude, larger lungs, blood packed with extra hemoglobin to grab more oxygen, stomachs that could pull nutrition from vegetation so sparse it barely qualified as grass. These adaptations meant yaks could thrive where other cattle would collapse from lack of air. Tibetan nomads didn't force a lowland animal to adapt. They worked with the one that already belonged. Clothing used the same principle as the tent, layers that trapped air and could be adjusted when conditions shifted. The traditional chuba, a long robe made from sheepskin with the wool facing inward, was the outer layer. On a warmer day, you could slip one arm out and leave the torso covered. The length kept legs protected without making it hard to ride or herd. Belting it at the waist created a pouch across the chest for holding tools, food, sometimes a small child. That pouch also trapped another layer of air for insulation. Underneath, people wore multiple layers of sheep or goat wool. In the coldest months, sometimes yak wool for the outer garments. Boots were yak leather with wool lining and felt soles. The felt kept feet insulated from frozen ground that would otherwise drain body heat with every step. Hats mattered more than you'd think. Sheepskin or fox fur with ear flaps protected the head and ears, where heat escapes fastest. For skin, they used yak butter. Nomads rubbed it on their faces and hands every day. At that altitude, the air is dry and UV radiation is intense. Without some kind of barrier, exposed skin would crack and split within days. It looked like a ritual, but it was just chemistry. The fat layer stopped moisture from leaving the skin and blocked wind. Butter also fueled the body. Butter tea, pocha, got consumed constantly. Black tea brewed strong, mixed with salt and yak butter, then churned until it emulsified. It tasted nothing like tea anywhere else. The salt helped the body hold on to water in air that dried you out fast. The fat gave you dense calories that kept you warm from the inside. When the cold forced your body to burn energy just to maintain core temperature, that caloric density kept you alive. Milk came mostly in summer when grazing improved, but nomads turned it into butter, cheese, and dried curds that lasted through winter. Dried cheese, chura, could keep for years. It didn't freeze solid like meat, and you could eat it while traveling or herding when stopping to cook wasn't an option. The fuel was dung. Without yak dung, there was no fire, no cooked food, no heat through the night. Fresh dung wouldn't burn. It had to dry completely first. Women and children collected it every day, shaped it into patties, and left it to dry on tent sides. Rocks, the ground, anywhere the sun hit. Dried dung burned slowly with steady heat. Not the fast, hot burn you get from wood, but something more sustained that kept temperature stable through long nights. How much you gathered in summer determined whether you survived winter. Families that collected and stored enough made it through. Families that didn't had to choose between freezing and starving. If you burned food stores for warmth, you had nothing left to eat. The soft undercoat of the yak, different from the coarse hair used for tents, got combed out during spring molting and spun into yarn. The fibers were hollow, trapping air the same way modern synthetic insulation does. Women spun it constantly. Clothing wore out fast in those conditions and needed replacing all the time. Textile production never stopped because the environment never stopped shredding fabric. Yaks also provided transport. Moving between seasonal pastures meant hauling everything a family owned. Yaks could carry heavy loads at altitude where horses struggled and carts were useless on rough ground. A family's wealth got measured partly by how many yaks they had, because more yaks meant more carrying capacity, which meant more ability to move resources when you needed to. This total dependence created detailed knowledge. Nomads understood yak behavior, health, breeding, and nutrition with the kind of precision that comes from knowing your life depends on it. They could tell which grazing patterns meant sickness, which animals would make it through winter and which wouldn't. How to time breeding so calves were born in spring instead of during the worst cold. The system was efficient because it had to be. Nothing got wasted. Yak hide became boots, ropes, containers. Bones became tools. Even the coarse hair too rough for textiles got twisted into rope or used for repairs. In an environment this marginal, waste meant death. But the system was also fragile. Disease that tore through a herd could wipe out a family's entire capacity to survive in a matter of days. A brutal winter that killed livestock didn't just remove food. It removed shelter material, fuel, clothing, and transport all at once. Nomads kept the largest herds they could manage because losses were guaranteed, and the only insurance was redundancy. Chapter 4. Nomads survived winter by moving away from it. The plateau didn't freeze uniformly. Summer warmed the high pastures and brought grass. Winter made those same spots unlivable while the lower valleys stayed just barely tolerable. The movement wasn't random. It was a calculated retreat and advance, tracking survivable conditions across hundreds of miles. Summer camps sat at the highest grazing lands, often above 5,000 meters. These areas greened for a few weeks when the snow melted, and the grass fattened herds before the next cold cycle. But they were completely exposed. Wind never stopped, there was no natural shelter, and even summer nights dropped below freezing. Families put up with it because the grass was worth it. When autumn came, they moved down and looked for terrain that blocked wind. Dips in the plateau, low ridges, anything that cut the gusts even a little. Winter camps sat lower where temperatures were only slightly less brutal, but wind was reduced. That reduction mattered. Wind chill turned survivable cold into something that killed you. Timing the moves took judgment built over lifetimes. Leave the summer pasture too early and you waste good grazing. Leave too late and an early storm traps you mid-migration with exposed herds and no shelter up. Nomads read signs, specific cloud shapes, how animals behaved, the angle of morning light, how frost formed on tent fabric overnight. Camp layout centered on the livestock. Tents clustered loosely, usually extended families, positioned to share whatever wind protection existed. Herds weren't fenced. There were no materials for fencing, and frozen ground wouldn't hold posts. Herders managed animals on foot every day, guiding them to pasture at dawn and bringing them back near camp before dark. Young animals and weak ones sometimes stayed close to tents overnight. Keeping them near protected wealth. A dead calf meant lost breeding stock and future milk, and their body heat added a little warmth to the camp. Dogs, usually Tibetan mastiffs bred for the cold, guarded herds through the night and alerted families to wolves that went after vulnerable livestock. Water became hard winter labor. Streams froze solid. Year-round springs were rare and incredibly valuable, often deciding where a winter camp could even be set up. When flowing water didn't exist, families melted snow over fires, slow and fuel-intensive, or broke through ice on frozen streams. Getting water every day was dangerous. Ice could give way, and wet clothing in that cold could kill you in hours. The movement itself prevented overgrazing. Grass on the plateau grew slowly during the short season and recovered even slower. Concentrated herds could wreck pasture in weeks. Moving regularly gave abandoned grazing areas months to recover before herds returned the next cycle. This wasn't philosophy. It was survival. Destroy your pastures and your herds starve. Lose your herds and you're dead. The landscape punished bad decisions immediately. Chapter 5. Social interdependence kept people alive. Nomad families clustered in small groups of related households because going it alone meant death. A family that lost animals to disease could get breeding stock from relatives. If someone got sick, others took over herd management. Moving camp needed everyone. Tents had to come down, pack animals had to be loaded, livestock had to move together across rough ground. Children learned by doing, not by being taught. At 5, they collected dung and helped with young animals. By their teens, they'd done the essential work thousands of times. Knowledge passed constantly. A kid learned to read weather by watching his father study cloud formations, learned to judge animal health by helping his mother check the herd each morning. Stories kept critical information alive. Warnings about dangerous ice, memories of bad winters and how families got through them, details about distant pastures and water sources. Oral tradition wasn't separate from survival. It was how knowledge stayed intact across generations. Tibetan Buddhism gave structure to days that might otherwise dissolve into monotony. Morning prayers, butter lamp offerings, meditation. These created routine when winter stretched on without variation. Religious practice offered comfort in a place where death was always near, and belief in karma might have eased the kind of fear that could freeze you up. But nomadic life took a toll. Lots of children didn't make it. Frostbite, injuries, accidents, people got disabled all the time. Life expectancy ran well below what you'd find in farming villages. Women faced pregnancy after pregnancy on top of hard physical work. Winter meant constant background danger. Falling through ice, getting lost in a sudden storm, freezing if your clothes got soaked. People lived this way not because they were tougher than everyone else, but because this was their world, their expertise, their best shot at independence in a place that didn't allow other options.